Hello, so this video is basically a reply to a video called Efilism Arguing the Argument by a YouTuber called blitheringgenius. Now, it's a bit of an old video. I think it was recorded around a year and a half ago. I did reach out after the video was recorded to blitheringgenius to have a discussion with him about Efilism. We had a discussion. I think he also recorded it and posted it on his Discord, but the quality of my mic wasn't so good. So it wasn't very optimal. So after a while, I've just decided to record this video to reply to his arguments because I think his arguments are valuable. There's not a lot of people who actually try to tackle Efilism in a constructive way or actually having any true discussion or true dialogue with the ideology. So I thought his criticism, even though I didn't agree with it, was all in all pretty constructive, and this video meant to tackle it. The second part of, let's say, the story is the fact that blitheringgenius had some kind of dialogue with, well, if you can call it a dialogue, with Inmendham, which is basically the founder of Efilism, and it got into a very, very unpleasant tones, and I did watch some of the videos between them, but they were, in my opinion, very, very unconstructive. Inmendham was very uncharitable, as he usually is, towards the arguments of BG. That's how I'm going to call blitheringgenius from now. And then BG replied to him also unpolitely, and there was not a lot of value there to be found because it wasn't really a dialogue. It was more two people kind of yelling at each other. So even though I agree with the ideology of Inmendham way more than I am with BG, I do have to admit I prefer the rhetorics and generally the civility and the style of BG over Inmendham. Even though I would consider myself as, you know, Efilist or Efilist adjacent, I don't feel that the way Inmendham carries himself or having arguments with other people is respectable or productive. So that's too bad, right? I can understand that he's pissed, and I can understand why the truths that he kind of learned about the world made him a bit more maybe cynical and jaded about people, and his way to deal with it is, you know, yelling at them and calling them names. But, you know, it's just more of a personal preference of mine. I just don't like it very much. Okay, without further ado, let's dive into the arguments themselves. So there are basically few arguments that BG raised, which I'm going to tackle here. It's not all of this video because a lot of it was also mentioned, as I mentioned, was dedicated to the rhetorics of Inmendham, which I'm not very interested in covering. I will cover the arguments that are more relevant to kind of tackle Efilism. Another thing is I'm not going to go through what is Efilism because it's already covered in the original video by blitheringgenius. And I would assume that anyone who's kind of enters this video already knows about Efilism, because otherwise, how the hell did you find this video, right? So I would assume you know what Efilism is, and I would assume that you also watched at least partially the video of blitheringgenius. So I wouldn't go like, you know, sentence by sentence like a lot of the videos doing. I'm just gonna kind of try to summarize his arguments and reply to them in the most, let's say, charitable way, and I'm going to try to make them as stronger as possible, and only then take them down to steelman them, as they say. Okay, so there are basically, let's say, 4 areas of arguments or sections or themes, which are, first of all, is the theory of desire, which BG shows, which is kind of Buddhistic theory that he proposes to how pleasure and pain, or let's say good valence states versus negative valence states work. He also claims that because of his theory, the suffering or the pain is and the pleasure, when they sum together, they're basically kind of zero sum. So kind of the pain and the pleasure cancels themselves. He also attacks hedonism, basically by proposing that hedonism is not all that it is, and it's not something that should be the most important thing that we look at it. He also discusses altruism and why he is also doesn't believe in altruism, and he thinks it's a fake. And eventually I'm going to summarize and try to kind of show you what I believe in and why I think his arguments are not very strong and not really tackling Efilism correctly. Okay, so let's start. So first is the theory of desire. The idea behind the theory of desire, what BG shows, is kind of a very simple mechanism of how good sensation or feelings are created, and how negative or bad sensations or feelings are created. And the idea is quite simple. So we have, because we are biological machines, we have desires. Those desires are crucial to our survival and to our reproduction. And basically each time when we have desire, like when desire rises, that creates some kind of level of pain or unsatisfaction. And then after the desire subdues, after we manage to get what we want, then we get pleasure as a reward in a way. Okay, so a very simple example would be hunger, right? So hunger is basically a desire for food. When we want food, we experience strong sensations of hunger until we eat, and then we enjoy the food. And then generally we had some kind of pain in terms of hunger, and then some kind of pleasure in terms of what we had when we ate our delicious meal. Okay, so far I'm not really arguing with it. I feel like it's a decent model. It does describe a lot of let's say processes that we have. It's true, it happens a lot of times. It also happens with sex, right? We feel desires towards having sex, and then we have sex, and then in the moment of climax we have the orgasm. So it's true that this process happens a lot, but the issue with it, it's not enough. Okay, so it's true that we have a lot of time of desires that increase, and then we solve them, but we also have a lot of sensations, positive or negative sensations, that is very hard to describe just by taking this process. Meaning this model is very, very partial, and it doesn't explain all the things that we have. So let's use some other examples and see how the model fits into them, right? So let's take phantom limb pain. So phantom limb pain is when someone has a limb that he lost, and then for some reason, usually it's because of some kind of maybe a bug in the brain or in the body, some kind of dysfunction, he starts feeling pain from the limb that doesn't exist anymore. So let's say someone has had his hand amputated, and now he feels like his arm is hurting where it's got cut, even though there is nothing there. So obviously there is some negative sensations there. So let's try to fit it to the desire framework. So what is exactly the desire that is being created and fulfilled here? The desire of having a hand, or I just know it just doesn't seem that there isn't any desire here. It just seems like some kind of error or some kind of problem with the body that creates that. Second example, let's say you want to go to a vacation, and then you going and starting reading about the place. Let's say you want to go to a vacation to Hawaii, so you go and read travel guides to Hawaii, and you look for your hotel, for a nice hotel, and you just browse and see images from Hawaii. And a lot of people say that this is the most pleasurable part in the vacation, is actually planning it, and it's true. It is fun to plan a vacation or a trip, and it also doesn't seem like there is a very obvious desire and satisfaction of desire here. So what is exactly the desire? Like, okay, I can understand maybe in terms of the vacation itself, what is this desire that is being fulfilled here, but the planning of the vacation, like what is the desire is for the vacation to be planned, and by planning it, by looking at images from Hawaii, I'm somehow fulfilling this desire. I mean, I guess you could go with it, but it just feels very, very weak, right? Because like I don't know, things like watching and fantasizing about the vacation is not even helping you in a, let's say, practical way to solve the problem of getting your vacation planned. Okay, so that also doesn't seem that it fits the framework well. Another example would be a joy that you have from meditation. So a lot of people, when we do a meditation, they experience pleasant feelings. Not always happens. Sometimes it's unpleasant as well, but in many cases it is pleasant for the meditator. So the question is exactly, again, what was the desire that was fulfilled here? It's extremely unclear. Why would sitting and watching your breath is fulfilling any obvious desire? Another example is when you think about things that happened to you before, and you cringe, right? You cringe like you did something very, very embarrassing a year ago. You did some social faux pas, and now you're completely embarrassed about it. And when you remember it, you feel pain, right? So again, what is the desire that is being built here? The desire of you not doing that in the past, but you cannot really ever fulfill this desire, right? So you only have a desire that is unfulfillable in a way, and then you feel pain for it. Again, it just doesn't feel like it fits well. The fifth one is enjoying video games. Also, let's say you're playing some, SimCity Builder. Unclear, like you could say maybe you have the desire of not being bored, and then you're playing video games, and then you fulfill the desire of not being bored. But it's true even if you're not bored, like even if you're doing something else. Let's say you're watching TV and you're enjoying it or not enjoying it so much, and then you're playing a video game, and that's, it just makes you feel good. It doesn't seem that it was like a desire that was really, really fulfilled here, unless you look at it in a very, very tautological way of like, every time that you do something that feels good, then it fulfills the desire. And then, okay, sure, then it works. But I don't think it's a good model if you need to kind of force it into it, and it doesn't give you any explanatory power. In the case of phantom limb pain, it for sure doesn't give you, it gives you zero explanatory power. And those are just 5 examples. It was very easy for me to think about. There are a lot of other examples that you can think about that will not fit this framework. Okay, so the next thing is, so what BG goes and says something along the lines of, okay, because every pleasure and every pain comes from experiencing desire and then kind of solving the desire, so you get into a zero-sum, let's say hedonic state. Okay, so you had the pain of the desire rising up, and then you had the pleasure of the desire being solved, and together they are at zero. So, well, first of all, even if you accept the desire framework, which I don't, if that wasn't unclear, it doesn't mean that the relief is equivalent to the pain, right? It could be that the pain of the desire is way, way stronger than the relief itself. Okay, and this is basically an empirical question, right? You can just kind of look at it empirically and how people behave themselves. How do you feel by yourself when you have a pain and then relief, and try to understand if it's always kind of zero sum. So the most obvious example where it's obviously not zero sum and it's undeniable is if you have a creature that is being tortured and then killed, right? Because obviously it doesn't even have the time to feel the relief before he's being killed. So that obviously in this case it's not happening, right? Like the pain is worse than the pleasure, and it does happen to a lot of creatures in the wild, right? Where you have a lot of animals that don't even reach maturity, so they just kind of like turtles. Like for sea turtles, only 1 out of 1,000 to 10,000 reaches an adult stage. Most of them die very, very young, either by starvation or they're getting predated. So, they're predators that are getting them. So obviously, they just have suffering and they have no relief out of it. So it's not just a theoretical example. It's something that happens in nature all the time. So this is like the most obvious counter argument, but I don't feel it's enough, right? Because it is an edge case. The second one, if it would be true, if the relief from suffering would be equivalent to the suffering when you experience it, then most people will be willing to go through torture for some kind of monetary reward. Not a large one, right? Like it just should be more than what we're earning at work, right? Because the idea is the following. Let's say you are tortured, but then after you finish being tortured, you have the same equivalent pleasure of being tortured. That means that if someone pays you nicely for it, then why shouldn't you do it? But I don't think that's the case. I don't think anyone would be willing to pass through an hour of torture for, I don't know, $100 an hour, right? For this hour. No one would be willing to be waterboarded for an hour for $100, even though theoretically, if the case was that he would feel the relief that is equivalent to the torture afterwards, then he should have agreed to it. But that's not the case because it's just not true. Okay, the relief that you're getting after it is not the same as the pain from the torture. Sometimes you also can have joy without pain, right? Sometimes you have just, you go and you're not really hungry, for example, and then you go eat a tasty meal, but you're not hungry before. You are enjoying the meal because, the food is really good, but you're not like before that were an hour and like in annoying and really bad hunger, and then that kind of made it equal, right? So sometimes you can even have joy that is better than the suffering you had before. And another thing with the zero-sum pleasure and pain kind of proves, because it proves too much, that everyone actually have the same level of hedonistic enjoyment in their life, which again to me seemed kind of preposterous, right? The idea of it like a Sudanese child soldier that is being abused has the same level of joy of, let's say, a rich American trust fund. Just doesn't seem to be the case. There are people who suffer way more than other people in life, and if you accept BG's theory of zero sum, that's not true, right? And it just doesn't seem probable. Also, if it would be true, you would expect to see that if you have like torture victims that had really, really bad time in their life, you would expect to see in their lives also days which are equivalent in terms of joy. So if they would be tortured, you would expect to see, let's say, I don't know, for a month, you would expect to see afterwards a month where they're having, let's say, some kind of euphoric ecstasy, right, to kind of compensate for it, or a year afterwards. But it doesn't seem to be the case, again. So, for example, there's a story of a man called Dex Cowart, which is it's a very famous case in medical literature. It was someone who was in a really bad explosion, and he got burns all over his body. He lost his eyes. He was in a horrible shape. He actually ran away from the explosion. He found a farmer and he asked him to commit suicide, to help him kill him, because he didn't want to live like that. He already understood that he was in a really bad shape. So this farmer didn't agree. He took him to the hospital, and miraculously Dex Cowart survived. But he went through horrible torture in his recovering process. They forced him to go through recovery for all his burns, and it was extremely painful. It took him, I think, a year just to get out of hospital, and he was begging them to kill him the entire time, and they just didn't agree. So after this year, you would expect him to have like a year of amazing ecstasy of like him waking up and he be happy that he's alive and like, I don't know, feel like orgasm all the time, right? Which is kind of, let's say, the equivalent of horrible torture he passed through. But that wasn't the case. Afterwards, he actually said that even though he survived that and now his life became okayish and even a bit positive, it still wasn't worth it. So he thought that all the gain that he got after his life, even though he lived to a, I think, pretty late age, he still claimed that like at the point where after he got the burns, it probably would be better for him to die than to go through all of it, which again, probably wouldn't be the case if the zero-sum pleasure and pain theory was correct. So I just reject it. It doesn't seem empirically valid. So the zero-sum pleasure and pain theory is just incorrect. There is more pain than pleasure in the world. Pain is stronger, and I stand by Mendham in his view that it's not equivalent. Okay, the next one is about hedonism. So one problem with hedonism is that when you think about hedonism, the word itself is already has a lot of other meaning attached to it. So when you think about hedonist, you think about someone who's like, doing drugs or just, having sex all day and just having pleasurable time all the time and only cares about pleasure, only cares about pain. But this is a very limited way to look at it, because it's not only about pleasure and pain. It's about suffering against non-suffering, okay? And to understand that pain and suffering are not equivalent, and pleasure and let's call it anti-suffering. When I mean anti-suffering, I mean positive valence states are also not equivalent, because you have things which are positive valence states which are not joy. So let's take the most simple example is obviously masochists who enjoy pain. So for them, even though they experience pain, it's not suffering for them. Okay. Another example is sadness, right? Sadness is a negative emotion, but it also doesn't entail suffering. Sometimes you can go to a movie and watch it and you enjoy the fact that you're sad. So it's not about it. And in terms of joy, you have other positive valence states which are not joy. For example, doing something that feels meaningful, right? So for example, let's say you're a soldier at the war and you're having a really bad times in terms of hedonistic state, right? It's really bad, you're in the mud, but you still feel a very strong inner conviction and you feel like you're doing something meaningful by defending your state. It's not joy, it's not pleasure, but it's something else, but it's still positive. Okay, so when I'm talking about suffering, I mean it in a way of like when you're experiencing something that is worse than nothing, meaning you would rather to be asleep or dead than experiencing it. If I would ask you, hey, I can add another year to your life, but in this entire year you're going to be completely tortured, then most people would probably say, no, I don't want to have this year. I would rather be dead. So this is the more correct framework to look at it. Okay, just hedonism misses the point here. If you want to really calculate it, you should calculate it by suffering versus, anti-suffering or versus positive valence states. Again, there's just not a good word for it in English, at least not one that I know of, which just kind of aggregates all the positive states of consciousness. But that's the idea, and it's very, very different than looking at it in a very narrow and hedonistic way. Okay, so what I propose is, again, as I said, is looking at in a way of like, do I want more of it or do I not want more of it? So if you're having some kind of experience, do I want to experience more of this type of experience or not? And the idea is it's pretty tautological, right? So it's good to experience stuff that you want more of, and it's not good to experience stuff that you want less of. And my claim is this is basically how all humans operate. Humans operate based on based on getting good sensations or good conscious states, and running away from negative conscious states. And all values are in a way, again, for each individual, are driven from it directly, because we are all programmed to have some things create positive states in us and other things create negative states in us. So just to give you an example of why I believe this is the case and why everything else kind of doesn't matter, I'll give you let's say a thought experiment. So BG says in the end of this video that he really appreciates life, and that he sees himself as a reproduction machine, and for him reproduction has value, right? Which is which is not necessarily by what he says related to sensation or to hedonistic views. It's more kind of an aesthetical, philosophical view about life. So let's imagine that someone like an evil surgeon from the future would come, and he would rewire BG's brain in a way that every time that he thinks about reproduction, about having sex, or about raising kids, he's going to have feeling of extreme disgust, nausea, and pain. Like just thinking about kids, about having kids, would trigger with him those sensations. And let's say it would be done by some kind of technological solution, right? Like kind of a Clockwork Orange style of maybe a bit more sophisticated, let's say surgery plus kind of suggestibility, brainwashing, whatever. It doesn't really matter, right? You understand the idea of it. Like you can do something like that. You can rewire a person to hate things, to find some things pleasurable and to find some things not pleasurable. So what I would claim that in this situation, and this is obviously not a provable claim, but I would claim that in this situation, BG would not want to reproduce. He would prioritize his sanity and him feeling okay over reproduction, because it would be just too hard to do it, despite the fact that he feels pain and disgust and nausea every time he just thinks about that, not mentioning doing it itself. So what actually BG is optimizing for, he says that he's optimizing for being a good reproduction machine, but he's still optimizing for his own sensations, which in his specific case, kind of driven towards being a reproduction machine. And in most people's case, this is the way it is. But it's still important to understand that what the conscious mind is optimizing for is not for the terminal goals, but for the sensations themselves. Meaning, sensations are stronger than those, terminal values, intellectual values of how you see the world or anything like that. So basically, yeah. So it's all about sensations, but it's not just hedonism. It's a more wide view of sensation, of positive and negative sensations. Okay, the next one is altruism and selfishness. So what BG says about that is something along the line of, no one is really altruist. Morality is fake / delusion. We're like, most people are selfish, and those who are not selfish are basically just want to feel good. Again, we're optimizing for our own sensations, but it's just the case that in their situation, when they send something positive, when they help others, right? Like we have some kind of maybe an release of hormones of like positive sensation. If it makes them positive sensations when they feed a cat or help someone else, but they still do it to feel the good feelings. And you know what? I completely agree about that. I completely agree with him that this is actually what happens, right? So most people are extremely selfish, and altruism is quite rare, right? A lot of people are maybe can be altruistic towards their friends or towards their family, but like just general global altruism is not a generally very common human trait, meaning most people are selfishly optimizing for their own benefit. Okay? Again, I agree with those two assertions, I guess, if he believes in them, right? I don't think he actually mentioned them as I put them here, but I feel like this is kind of what he, I guess, points to. Okay? So again, I agree, but very few other points that I want to mention about this. So first of all, there's a variance between different people in terms of selfishness versus altruism. So it's true that most people are very, very selfish, but there's still levels to it, right? So you can think of from one side, someone who's generally just a really nice person who helps people around him, willing to sacrifice some of his own resources to help other people. There are people like that, right? Not many of them, but some are just like that. Obviously, they're still going to be selfish in a way, right? They still need to kind of make sure that they are living and they're not being killed or exploited, or they're not just going to give all their money to someone who is less fortunate, right? Because they're just going to be very, very poor and miserable if they're going to do that. So they're still going to be somewhat selfish, okay? But they're going to be also somewhat altruistic. Versus, let's say on the other end, you have like the sadistic sociopath, right? It's like someone who's not only selfish, he's getting a kink from like hurting other people. Okay, so it makes him good when he sees others suffer around him, right? So it's important to capture that for different people, life could look differently, right? Because we have different values. And I feel like altruism is not completely fake. So in all of us, there is some level of altruism, right? Because of the fact that we need to build coalitions and work with other people around us in our tribe in terms of evolutionary speaking. So most people have some kind of altruism in them. Again, it's not super strong. But it's also not correct to assume that like we're all completely selfish and we're like, no, altruism is completely fake, it doesn't exist at all. Okay, so that's my point. It does exist. Most people are somewhat altruistic. I would say most people are at least not sadistic. Okay, so we come to so the point of it is the following. The point of it is, it's true that I cannot argue with a sadistic sociopath who could look at life and say, okay, I really love the fact that there's like a lot of carnage, and life is all about animals eating each other and humans eating animals and humans manipulating each other and torture and all this insanity that goes around on Earth. But I like it. I enjoy seeing people suffer, and it's the fact that I enjoy it is not less correct than of you disliking it, right? It's just a matter of different preferences. And I would have to say to this sociopath, yeah, you're right. It's true. We have different preferences. I think you're a monster, right? You're my enemy just by being the way you are. And I think most people are not like that. I think most people, in terms of, let's say, coalition building, or if you're looking at it as a consensus, most people are not sadistic sociopaths. They do want other people around them to be happy in general, as long as they are happy. Okay, I think that's a more accurate representation of the nature of humans. Another thing that is also worthwhile mentioning is, even if you're completely selfish, right, unless you're maybe sadistic, you can still accept that the game is bad, right? You can still accept that Efilism is correct, and you can say, okay, that's right. It's like, okay, life is bad. Most other consciousness are suffering, but I'm enjoying it. Like, my life is good. I enjoy the experience of having here, but yeah, but it's still true that life is mostly hellish, right? So it doesn't have to kind of contradict one each other, right? You can still be completely selfish. You can still reject altruism, while saying that in the general sense, most creatures in this world are suffering, and that's bad, right? It's not bad enough for you to do anything about it, but it's still bad, and it still makes the world a pretty horrible place, okay? And again, another kind of thought experiment that if you can think about it as kind of a reverse Omelas. So in Omelas, which again I would assume most of the people who's going to watch this video already kind of know about, the idea is you have this amazing city, glorious utopia, that is built on the pain and suffering of one single child, right? And the fact that he's suffering and in pain, that's what allows this city to exist. It's a story by Ursula K. Le Guin. And you can think about a reverse Omelas. So basically you have only one person who is happy and billions of people who are suffering, right? Who are being tortured for this one person to be happy. And then the question is this world bad? Now, for BG, if he's the person who's not suffering, then it's okay. He rejects altruism. He says, it doesn't matter that other people are suffering. And, for me, this kind of world is fine. Like, if I would exist in it, it should be okay, right? Like, that's at least how I understand his view. And, just from my point of view, from my set of preferences, which again is not the real truth or anything like that, but I would assume that most people are, not most, but a lot of people are close to me. That seems like a monstrous setup. I would not want to exist in this kind of world. If I would have the option to live in a reverse Omelas versus not living at all, I would, again, for me as I am right now, right, I would choose not to live. I would choose to forgo the opportunity of being happy in a world where everyone else is being tortured, over being exist in this kind of world. Just because I don't think I would ever be able to be, happy or live well, knowing that, other people are being tortured. And, my moral view is, again, my preferences means that this is negative and I wouldn't want to live in a world like this. And again, from my point of view, anyone else who is willing to live in a world like this is a monster. And is evil. But again, this is subjective, right? Like someone else could say that I'm evil or whatever. Next. So my summary is the following. Basically, there are no values outside of sensations. Contrary to what BG says, if he would have negative sensations regarding reproduction, he wouldn't reproduce. Okay, what the conscious mind is optimizing for is sensations and not anything else. All the terminal values are being determined by what our sensations are saying about them, and we don't choose what kind of sensations we're going to feel. Second one, there is more suffering than anti-suffering or positive balanced states in the world, because extreme suffering is so bad. Okay, because it's almost impossible to compensate for torture. It doesn't matter how well you're gonna live. You can live well for 30 or 40 years. Extreme suffering is tramps that. It's just not worth it. And life is so full of extreme suffering, even now, in places like hospitals, prisons, just third world countries. There's so much that just regular human life is not enough to compensate for it. So if you're gonna kind of try to aggregate it all together, you're gonna get a negative results. And in total, life is net negative, which means Efilism is correct. So yeah, so that's the video. Would love to hear your replies in the comments. It's my first YouTube video, so I would also be happy to hear any feedback that you have in terms of my presentation. I know it's not perfect, but I'm going to try to improve. Thank you very much.